Sarah Jensen had never planned for her life to be this complicated. She was just a mom trying to keep everything together on Novus Prime, a quiet colony at the edge of the galaxy. Her son Ethan was everything to her, and as far as she was concerned, that was enough. Her world revolved around his schoolwork, his hobbies, and making sure his meals were on time. Her life was ordinary, or at least it had been until today, when Ethan hadn't come home from his school trip to the nearby mining planet. At first, she thought nothing of it. She assumed he'd stayed a little longer with friends, or was caught up in a conversation about some new video game. She could hear his voice in her mind, laughing about the latest challenge in the game. But when the hours ticked by and the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah started to feel that familiar tightness in her chest, the kind that mothers know too well, a feeling that something wasn't right. By the time it was midnight, Sarah had already called the school twice and received nothing but vague assurances from the administrative assistant, who claimed Ethan was probably fine, just a few more hours, and he'd be back. It was a strange comfort, knowing they were at least trying to calm her fears. But Sarah was done with the empty words. She pulled on her boots, grabbed her jacket, and marched out to the main hub of the colony. There was no one at the colony's security office. When she arrived, the doors automatically slid open, and she stepped inside the cool, sterile hallway that smelled faintly of metal and recycled air. The security officer, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, was sitting behind the desk, looking bored. Sarah's heart thudded with impatience. She tried to keep her voice steady, but the fear crept through, no matter how hard she fought it. "Where is Ethan?" she asked. The officer barely looked up from his tablet. "Oh, right, your son, yeah. I remember his trip. He's probably just waiting for the shuttle to return or caught up, talking with the other kids." "I don't care about the other kids, I care about my son," Sarah said, her tone sharp and biting. She felt the anger rise within her. It felt like fire in her veins. "I want to know where he is, and why he hasn't come back. I'm not waiting any longer." The officer finally looked at her, his expression softening just slightly. "I can file a report and start a search, but we're going to need some time to get confirmation." Sarah's frustration boiled over. She slammed her hand onto the counter with more force than she intended, and the young officer jumped back, startled. "I don't care about reports, I care about my son. If you're not going to do something, then I will." She stormed out of the building without waiting for another word. The moment she stepped outside, the cold air hit her face like a slap, but she didn't feel it. She didn't care. She was already thinking of her next move. The only thing that mattered now was finding Ethan. But where could she even start? The last place she knew he'd been was on that mining planet, the one with the shuttle system that barely functioned anymore. And with a sinking feeling, she realized no one was going to help her. They had no idea what she was dealing with, a mother desperate to find her child. Her shuttle wasn't much. It was a small thing, barely bigger than a cargo pod, but it was hers, and she knew how to fly it better than anyone else. She had no time to wait for permission or for anyone else to act, so she punched in the coordinates for the mining planet and strapped herself into the pilot's seat. Her hands gripped the controls. As she let out a deep breath, she was scared, but she wasn't backing down. She would find Ethan, no matter what it took. Sarah's shuttle hummed to life as it sliced through the empty darkness of space. She didn't look back at Novus Prime as it faded into the distance. Her focus was solely on the path ahead. The quiet mining planet, barely a dot on the navigation system, was her destination, and she had no intention of turning back. She knew the risks, but her son was out there, and that was all that mattered. The journey felt longer than it should have. Her mind was racing with questions. What if something had happened to Ethan? What if he was hurt, or worse, what if she was too late? The thought gnawed at her like a gnawing pain in her chest. She tried to push it aside, focusing on the controls and the soft glow of the instrument panel. But it was hard to keep calm when the entire universe felt like it was conspiring against her. Just as Sarah was about to enter the mining planet's atmosphere, a blip appeared on her radar. It was small, at first barely noticeable, but as it grew closer, her heart skipped a beat. Her instincts told her it wasn't a civilian ship. It wasn't even a freighter. It was something far more dangerous. An unfamiliar signature spiked on the radar, and she cursed under her breath. Without thinking, she adjusted her course, trying to avoid detection. but the ship was closing in fast. She could see it now, a sleek black craft of unknown design, and it was heading straight for her. She didn't have time to figure out what was happening as her hand slammed down on the throttle, pushing the shuttle into evasive maneuvers. Her stomach lurched as she turned sharply to the left and then to the right, the shuttle shaking violently as she fought to keep control. The enemy ship followed her every move like a predator to its prey, and Sarah's hands shook on the controls. It was no use. The Zorvek fleet was upon her. She could see their enormous ships, now looming in the blackness of space, towering and intimidating, their weapon systems powering up. She had no chance of outrunning them, even as she tried. But in that moment, something strange happened. Sarah's anger took over. With a growl, she slammed her hands down on the console, typing commands, blindly, her frustration growing until she hit a button she hadn't meant to push, a set of emergency protocols that activated the shuttle's automated defense systems. The ship shuddered as a barrage of energy blasts fired from hidden turrets, striking the Zorvek ships with pinpoint accuracy. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief as explosions rang out in the void of space. The Zorvek fleet had been utterly annihilated. In a matter of seconds, their ships scattered and broken in a fiery cloud of debris. She sat in stunned silence, her heart hammering in her chest, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. She had no idea how or why her ship had done that, but she was alive, and somehow the threat had vanished. For a moment, she allowed herself a breath of relief. But then panic set in. What had she just done? Who were these people that had tried to kill her? And where did they think she was going? She glanced back at the fading remnants of the Zorvek fleet, and for the first time realized she might be in far more trouble than she'd ever imagined. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong even as she continued her course toward the mining planet, her hands still shaking from the strange encounter with the Zorvek fleet. She stared at the remnants of their ships on the radar, and then back at the empty void ahead of her. She had never been in a battle before, let alone caused one so devastating. And yet here she was, a mother on a quest to find her son who had just unknowingly wiped out a powerful alien fleet. As the minutes passed, a strange message appeared on her console. The transmission was encrypted, but there was no mistaking the tone. It wasn't a standard communication, and it was coming from multiple sources across the galaxy. She hesitated before answering, her mind racing with questions about who could be contacting her and why. Unidentified vessel, this is Commander Rix of the Central Coalition. We've been tracking your ship for several hours, and we believe you might be able to assist us in a most important matter. Sarah blinked in confusion and then typed out a quick response, not even sure what she was saying but determined to get answers. I'm not interested in any of your political games. I just want to find my son. The transmission crackled, but then continued as if she hadn't spoken at all. We understand your frustration, and we don't wish to waste your time. However, we've intercepted significant information about your ship's recent actions. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her ship's actions. She was starting to realize that maybe this wasn't a coincidence. Maybe something far bigger was going on. Your ship has taken down a Zorvek warlord fleet. You are now considered an invaluable asset to our cause. She almost choked at the mention of her ship and the words warrior fleet. In the same sentence, her mind couldn't make sense of it. She had been flying a barely functional shuttle through the galaxy, trying to find her son, not taking down fleets. Wait, what did you just say? I'm just a mom looking for my kid. A pause, then the transmission continued. Perhaps, but your ship's abilities suggest otherwise. Your sudden appearance in Zorvek space has become the talk of multiple sectors. Her mind reeled from the information. What did they mean, her ship's abilities? And how had they tracked her this entire time? How much had she been unaware of? Listen, I don't care about your coalition or your politics. I care about getting my son back. And I don't have time for whatever you think I am, she responded as the words poured out before she could stop them. Very well, the voice on the other end said coolly, but know this, you have just made a powerful enemy in the Zorvek Empire, and they will come for you the moment they regroup. You might need our help after all. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach, the realization settling in that she had just become part of something far bigger than she ever imagined. She was just trying to find Ethan, but now she was caught in a web of galactic power struggles and interstellar politics. Her mind was racing as she tried to refocus on the task at hand. She needed to find Ethan. Nothing else mattered, not the warlords, not the political factions, not the threat of an entire empire. She had a mission, and nothing was going to stop her from completing it. As her shuttle drifted closer to the mining planet, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her. But she couldn't let herself get distracted. She needed answers. She needed her son. She couldn't afford to let anything else get in her way. Sarah touched down on the mining planet, her shuttle shuddering slightly as it made contact with the worn landing pad. The harsh winds whipped around her, and the smell of scorched metal filled the air. She didn't have much time to adjust before a group of rebels in makeshift uniforms approached her shuttle with grim expressions. Their leader, a tall woman with short cropped hair, stepped forward and saluted. "You must be the one," the woman said, her voice tinged with something Sarah couldn't quite place, but it wasn't warmth. "Who are you and what do you want?" Sarah snapped, feeling the weight of the situation crushing her chest. She wasn't in the mood for pleasantries, especially not from strangers who seemed to think they knew what was best for her. "We're part of the Central Coalition," the woman explained. "We've been tracking you since your little encounter with the Zorvek fleet." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the encounter. She wasn't ready to think about that yet. She had barely processed what had happened, much less the fact that people across the galaxy seemed to know about it already. "I told you I don't want any part of your war," Sarah said, her hands balling into fists. "I just need to find my son." The woman's eyes softened just slightly as if she understood, but her expression quickly hardened again. "We understand that, but you're in this now whether you like it or not." She paused, then added, "You're the key to defeating the Zorvek." Sarah blinked, staring at the woman in disbelief. "What do you mean the key? I don't even know what I did out there." The woman glanced over her shoulder at a group of rebels who were now approaching with weapons slung across their backs. "Your ship isn't just a standard model. We've analyzed the attack you launched on the Zorvek fleet, and it's unlike anything we've seen before. You're not just some random civilian. Your ship has hidden systems far beyond anything we've encountered." Sarah shook her head, her mind spinning. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't even a pilot. She had no idea how her ship had done what it had done. And now these people were looking at her as if she was some kind of hero or weapon. "I'm just trying to find my son," she said, her voice shaking with frustration. "I didn't ask for this." The woman stepped closer and lowered her voice. "We understand, but whether you asked for it or not, you're in the middle of something far bigger than a missing child." She paused again, her tone shifting. "We need you, Sarah. We need your ship's abilities to take down the Zorvek once and for all." Sarah's throat tightened at the mention of her name. They knew too much. They were already using her as a pawn in their game. But she didn't care about their politics or their war. She only cared about getting Ethan back. But what choice did she have? She couldn't face the Zorvek on her own, and these people seemed to have the knowledge and resources to help her find him. "I don't have time for your war," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. She could hear the desperation creeping in despite herself. "But if you can help me find Ethan, I'll listen to what you have to say." The woman nodded. "That's all we ask for now." She extended her hand. "Welcome to the fight." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then took the woman's hand, reluctantly accepting the reality of her situation. She wasn't a fighter, she wasn't a general, but for the first time in her life, she realized that maybe she didn't need to be. She just needed to survive long enough to bring Ethan home. Sarah didn't know how long she'd been on the mining planet. All she knew was that the urgency in her chest never seemed to lessen. The rebels had taken her to their hidden base, a rundown structure deep within the planet's craters. They had given her food and equipment, but the entire time her mind was elsewhere, on Ethan and the chilling message that had been broadcast by the Zorvek, a ransom demand she hadn't even wanted to hear, but she couldn't ignore. The transmission had been intercepted and decoded by the Central Coalition. They had shown it to her as if it was just another piece of intelligence to analyze, but Sarah's world had stopped when she saw Ethan's face on the screen, his hands bound and a bandage wrapped around his forehead. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable, and in that moment everything else faded. The politics, the factions, the war, none of it mattered anymore. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The central leader, Rick, stepped forward with a grim look on his face. We traced the signal. It came from a remote Zorvek fortress on a moon near their capital. It's a heavily fortified location. Even for them, we don't know exactly what they want with him, but it's likely they've taken him as leverage to draw us out. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing. She had no idea what kind of fortress the Zorvek had, but she didn't care. She wasn't going to waste any more time. "I don't care what it takes, I'm going after him," she said, her voice hard with determination. Rick's expression softened slightly, but there was a coldness to his gaze when he spoke again. "It's too dangerous. They won't just let you walk in and grab him, Sarah. You'll need our help." "I don't care about your help. I'm going to get my son," Sarah said, her voice rising. "I didn't sign up for this war, but I'm sure as hell not going to stand here and do nothing." Rick paused for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well, we'll assist you, but you'll need to be prepared. This won't be easy." The rebels quickly began to organize a plan of attack, but Sarah barely listened. She wasn't concerned with the strategy or the odds. She just wanted to get to Ethan and make sure he was safe. Within hours, Sarah found herself aboard a rebel ship, a battered vessel that could barely hold together, but it would get her to the Zorvek stronghold. The journey felt like it lasted an eternity, every minute pulling her farther away from everything she knew. She glanced at the crew of rebels who surrounded her as if they were her allies, but for the first time in her life, she felt utterly alone. The ship broke through the atmosphere of the moon, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she saw the fortress ahead. It was massive, far larger than anything she could have imagined, and covered in a maze of weapons, turrets, and defensive shields. She had no idea how they were going to get in, but she didn't care. "I'm getting my son," Sarah whispered to herself again, and again she repeated it like a mantra, trying to drown out the fear creeping into her mind. As the rebel ship approached the fortress, the defenses powered up. The air grew heavy with tension, and Sarah's pulse quickened. But nothing mattered, not the weapons, not the fortress walls, not the overwhelming odds they would face. Her only focus was Ethan and the promise she had made to herself. She was going to get him back, no matter what the cost. The rebel ship lurched as it entered the outer perimeter of the Zorvek fortress. Sarah gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles white, her stomach in knots. She had never done anything like this before, never imagined that she'd be charging into the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by a ragtag group of strangers, ready to fight a war that wasn't hers. But none of that mattered now. She was here to find Ethan, to bring him home, and that singular thought pushed everything else out of her mind. The fortress loomed larger as they drew closer, the towering walls and heavy turrets almost mocking their small ship. But Sarah refused to flinch. She focused on the task ahead. The plan they had put together was simple enough: grab Ethan, and get out. But even she knew how ridiculous that sounded as the ship shuddered again, and the warning lights flashed red. "Shields are failing," one of the rebel crew shouted from the back. Sarah's eyes darted to the screens, her heart racing as the ship's energy flickered. The Zorvek had already spotted them, and the fortress was responding quickly. "Hold on," she shouted and slammed her fist onto the console. "We're not turning back now." The ship jerked violently as they took fire, but the shields managed to hold just long enough for them to make it past the first layer of defenses. The fortress walls loomed ahead like a jagged cliffside, and Sarah's mind worked furiously. She needed to think fast. The plan had already gone off course. They were supposed to approach the north entrance, not the heavily guarded southern one, but now they had no choice. "We're going in from the south," Sarah barked and gripped the controls, her voice calm. Even though her heart was racing, the rebels exchanged nervous glances, but followed her lead without hesitation. She was in charge now, whether they liked it or not. The ship nosedived sharply toward the fortress's ground entrance, shaking as they hit the lower atmosphere. The crew worked furiously to keep the ship stable, but all Sarah could do was watch the massive walls of the fortress rapidly approaching. With a sharp turn, the ship's engines screeched as they barely avoided a direct hit from a Zorvek cannon. Sarah let out a curse and slammed the control stick to the left, trying to make a quick exit, but the fortress was too vast. There was nowhere to hide. They were caught in a trap. "Abort the mission," Rick shouted from behind her. "We need to pull back." No, Sarah snapped. The word came out harsh and final. She wasn't backing down now. I'm getting in there, and I'm getting Ethan. She saw a small gap in the fortress's defenses, just ahead a service tunnel hidden behind one of the large turrets. The ship barely cleared the entrance as it shot toward the opening. Everyone braced for impact. Sarah yelled as the ship shuddered again. The sounds of blasts and alarms filled the cockpit. The ship was almost through the tunnel when another blast hit the tail end, sending the ship veering out of control and straight into a wall. The entire ship lurched to one side as it crashed into the side of the fortress with a deafening screech. For a moment, everything was silent. Sarah was thrown against her seat, the impact making her head spin, but she didn't have time to recover. She quickly checked the status of the crew. They were all alive, some worse for wear, but alive. "We're inside," she muttered under her breath, and in that moment, despite everything, she felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the entire mission had begun. The fortress was bigger than she could have imagined, a maze of corridors and hallways twisting in every direction. The rebels began to mobilize quickly, preparing to move out. But Sarah wasn't waiting for orders. She grabbed a gun off the wall and headed for the exit. She wasn't just here to find Ethan, she was here to fight her way to him, and nothing was going to stop her. As she stepped into the dark hallway, the sound of distant footsteps echoed her pulse, quickened her focus laser sharp. She could feel the weight of everything she had fought for leading her forward, and she knew that no matter what came next, she wasn't leaving without Ethan. The hallways of the Zorvek fortress stretched endlessly before Sarah. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, but her resolve never wavered. She couldn't afford to hesitate, not when Ethan was so close. She could almost feel his presence in the cold air, the faintest whisper of hope in the back of her mind, urging her forward. The rebels moved cautiously behind her, their weapons drawn, every step synchronized. As they entered deeper into the labyrinthine structure, Sarah didn't speak to them. She didn't need to. She was focused entirely on the mission, finding Ethan and getting him out of this nightmare. The walls of the fortress were smooth and metallic, glistening in the dim light, their cold surfaces reflecting their faces as they moved past. But there was no time to stop, no time to appreciate the alien architecture. Sarah could hear the sound of movement ahead, the distant click of boots on metal floors, the unmistakable presence of Zorvek soldiers patrolling the area. She could only guess how many they were, but she knew it wouldn't take long before they realized they had company. Ahead, one of the rebels signaled a stop. The others dropped into a crouch as Sarah motioned for them to stay silent. She peered around the corner of the hallway. Into the next chamber ahead of them were at least 6 Zorvek soldiers stationed around a large reinforced door, the kind Sarah knew from the intel was used for high-security prisoners. Her breath caught in her throat. Ethan was behind that door. She glanced back at the rebels, her pulse pounding in her ears. "We need to get past them," she whispered, her eyes locked on the door, the only thing that mattered now. Rick stepped forward, his face grim. "We don't have the numbers to fight them head-on. We'll need to cause a diversion." Sarah's mind raced. She had no time to waste, and as she was going to take a risk, it would be now. "I'll do it," she said before Rick could protest. She already knew what needed to be done. She wasn't about to sit behind the lines while the others fought. "No," Rick said sharply, "you're the key to this mission. We need you alive." But Sarah was already moving. She didn't have time to argue. She was already slipping into the shadows and heading toward the control panel. Near the back of the room, it was risky, and she knew it, but it was her best shot. The sounds of the Zorvek soldiers grew louder as Sarah approached the panel, her hands steady. Despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, she accessed the panel quickly and found what she was looking for, a way to activate the fortress's emergency alarm system without being detected. With a quick press of a button, alarms blared throughout the complex, and the soldiers ahead spun around in confusion. The distraction was enough for Sarah to slip back into the shadows unnoticed. The rebels quickly followed her lead, using the chaos to their advantage. The Zorvek soldiers were split into disarray as they scrambled to figure out what was happening, and in the midst of the confusion, Sarah led the charge toward the reinforced door. She didn't care about the traps or the guards. The only thing she cared about was the possibility that Ethan was just beyond that door, and she couldn't let anything stop her from reaching him. When they reached the door, Sarah grabbed the handle and yanked it open. To her surprise, the door gave way with a loud mechanical groan. She motioned for the rebels to follow and stepped inside, her heart thumping so hard she could barely hear anything else. Inside, the room was dark and cold, but in the corner she saw him, Ethan, his arms bound to a chair and his head hung low, his face bruised, but his eyes were still closed in exhaustion. Ethan, Sarah's voice cracked with emotion as she rushed to his side. She tore the bonds from his wrists and lifted him into her arms. He stirred as if hearing her voice for the first time. "Mom," his voice was weak, but it was enough. "I'm here, baby, I'm here," she whispered over and over as she held him tight. Outside, the sound of reinforcements could be heard approaching, but none of that mattered now. Sarah had what she came for, and she wasn't leaving without him, no matter what else lay ahead. Sarah's heart was racing as she cradled Ethan in her arms, his weight heavy but comforting against her chest, his head resting on her shoulder. She could feel his breath against her skin, and it grounded her in the chaos that surrounded them. The room was filled with the echoes of alarms blaring and the rush of footsteps, but she didn't care. None of that mattered now. The rebels were trying to secure the exit, but Sarah barely registered their movements. Her focus was entirely on Ethan, his bruises, his pain, her mind replaying the horror of seeing him like this. She gently shook him, trying to rouse him, but he barely stirred. "Ethan," she whispered again, her voice shaky but firm. "Baby, come on, wake up." His eyelids fluttered and then slowly opened. His eyes were blurry, but the recognition was there. She could see it, and it made her breathe a little easier. "Mom," his voice was hoarse, but stronger than she expected. "I knew you'd come." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she kissed the top of his head. "I promised you, didn't I? I'm not leaving without you." She held him closer, her own relief mingling with a sharp pang of fury that had been growing inside her since the moment she saw him on that screen. The sound of enemy soldiers getting closer reached her ears, and she knew they didn't have much time before the Zorvek realized what had happened. She could feel the rage building inside her, her fear for Ethan morphing into something darker, something more dangerous. "They're coming," Rix shouted from the doorway. "We need to move now." Sarah glanced at the rebels, who were positioning themselves at the entrance, trying to set up a perimeter, but her mind was elsewhere. She wasn't thinking about escape routes or defense plans. She wasn't thinking at all. She was thinking only about one thing, and one thing only. "Get out of the way," she snapped, her voice hard and cold as she stood tall with Ethan in her arms, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She wasn't just going to run. She wasn't going to flee like some cornered animal. No, she was done running. "Sarah, wait," Rix called, but she didn't listen. She was already moving. She turned to face the door, her breath steady. Despite the pounding of her heart, she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, making her every step purposeful. Her eyes locked on the corridor beyond the door, where she could see the faint outlines of the approaching Zorvek soldiers. They wouldn't be able to stop her, not this time. With a scream of fury, she threw herself into the corridor, the rebels following quickly behind her. She didn't wait, she didn't hesitate. She burst through the door and faced the oncoming Zorvek head-on. The first soldier to appear around the corner barely had time to react before Sarah raised her weapon and fired without mercy. The blast hit him square in the chest and sent him flying back into the shadows. She barely paused before turning her attention to the next group that had emerged from a side hall. Each shot was like a bolt of lightning, each movement precise and controlled as her rage fueled every action. The rebels were right behind her, firing in tandem. But it was Sarah who led the charge. It was Sarah who pushed forward with a mother's fury driving her. The Zorvek soldiers hesitated for just a moment, unsure how to handle her. She could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that they had underestimated her, that they had made a terrible mistake. But she didn't care about their fear. She cared only about Ethan and getting him out of here. With a roar, Sarah charged into the next wave of enemies, her gun raised and her mind blank except for one single thought. She was done being hunted. She was done being a victim. Now she was the hunter, and she wasn't going to stop until every last one of them was lying at her feet. Rix and the other rebels followed in her wake as they cut their way through the soldiers, but it was clear that they were only there to cover her. They were nothing compared to the unstoppable force that Sarah had become with Ethan in her arms, and the fury of a mother whose child had been taken from her. The path ahead was still dangerous, but Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She was done running, she was done hiding, and now the Zorvek were going to learn that lesson the hard way. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed on through the fortress, every step driven by pure instinct, and a need to protect Ethan. The gunshots, the explosions, the chaos of the battle all blurred into the background. She didn't hear them, she didn't care about anything except getting out with her son. The Zorvek soldiers were relentless, but they were starting to realize that they had underestimated the force they were facing. A mother who had nothing left to lose. Sarah's every movement was calculated. She moved through the dark hallways like a shadow, her eyes always ahead, scanning for threats, but her heart only on Ethan. They reached a large chamber at the center of the fortress, and Sarah paused only for a moment to assess the situation. It was clear this was where the final stand would happen. Ahead of them lay a reinforced exit, surrounded by more Zorvek soldiers. She didn't need to see their weapons to know that they were heavily armed. "We can't go through there." Rick set his voice tight with tension. "There's too many of them." Sarah didn't even look at him, her gaze fixed on the exit. She could see the light outside, beyond the walls, the freedom she had been fighting for. But she wasn't about to give up, not now, not after everything. "We're going through," she said, her voice low and deadly, "and we're going to fight our way out if we have to." Rick stepped closer, his expression strained. "We need a plan, Sarah. We can't just charge in and hope for the best." But Sarah was already moving. She wasn't listening to anyone anymore. She had come too far, and she wasn't stopping now. Her mind was locked on one goal, and that goal was leaving this hellhole with Ethan safe. The rebels followed her lead. Even if they hesitated, they had no choice now. They were all in this together. As they approached the door, Sarah's anger reached its peak. The Zorvek soldiers had begun to surround them, positioning themselves in strategic locations. She could feel the weight of their weapons aimed at them, but Sarah didn't care. With a fierce roar, she charged forward and opened fire before anyone could stop her, her gun blazing as she cut down the first few soldiers in her path. The rebels followed suit, unleashing a barrage of shots into the enemy. But Sarah moved like a storm, her mind calm, her focus unbreakable. Each shot she fired was precise, each step calculated. As she pushed through the Zorvek soldiers, who were now scrambling to react, she felt nothing but the adrenaline coursing through her veins, the need to protect Ethan pushing her forward. But even as they pushed closer to the exit, the Zorvek soldiers were relentless. They were regrouping, reinforcing their positions, and closing in on all sides. Sarah knew that time was running out, and they wouldn't be able to hold them off much longer. "Get Ethan to the exit," she shouted to Rix as she turned to face the oncoming wave of soldiers. "Now." Rix hesitated, but then nodded, his expression hardening. With resolve, he signaled to the rebels to make a break for it. Sarah's gunfire covered them as they moved, but she knew that she was buying them only a little time. She fought on with everything she had, her gun, never slowing her feet, never faltering, but the reality of their situation began to settle in. There were too many Zorvek soldiers, and the rebels were outgunned. She knew they couldn't keep this up forever. But Sarah wasn't about to give up, not without a fight. Her mind worked furiously as she scanned the battlefield. She needed a way out, a way to ensure they all made it out alive, and she had one last card to play. With a deep breath, she detonated the explosives she had planted earlier in the fortress walls. The massive explosion rocked the structure, sending shockwaves through the air. The ground trembled beneath her feet as the fortress's foundation buckled and groaned. The Zorvek soldiers were thrown off balance as the walls around them began to collapse. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ethan's hand and ran for the exit as the fortress around them crumbled, the sound of destruction ringing in her ears. They broke through the final line of soldiers just as the explosion's shockwave sent debris flying in every direction. Sarah pulled Ethan into the light outside as the Zorvek stronghold fell into chaos behind them. They had done it, they had escaped, and Sarah had done what she promised she would do. She had saved her son, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she felt a wave of relief crash over her. But she knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The Zorvek would come after them. But for now they were free, and Sarah would fight to keep it that way, no matter what came next. No matter what she had to face, she would protect Ethan with every breath in her body.